Well, my name is Abdullah Said. I'll be chairing this session. The director of the Festival of Ideas, Your Excellencies, alumni of the university, members of the university community, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, a very warm welcome to you to this very important session. I'm glad to see so many people attending this session. I'll say a couple of things before I introduce the speakers. First of all, the topic we are dealing with is Islam and Muslims. Often in these sessions, we expect very standard answers, very relatively simple answers sometimes. Often we expect very complicated answers. These are complex issues that we're dealing with. Islam is not one thing. Muslims are not one community. There are plenty of different voices among Muslims within Australia at a global level. The three of us who are sitting here, well, we are all Muslims, but we may have very different views about important issues that Muslims face or Islam is supposed to face. Before 9/11, well, Australians were not particularly interested at a community level about Islam. There were, of course, Muslim-related issues. After 9/11, this became a very important topic. Seminars, discussions, lectures, conferences, you name it, courses in the universities. We might think that the so-called resurgence of Islam actually begins with 9/11. It's not quite the case. Resurgence of religious traditions, Islam included, actually goes to roughly middle of the 20th century in the way we know it. It is a phenomenon that we saw right throughout the world with Buddhism, Hinduism, Christianity, Judaism, Islam, and others. Of course, 9/11 was a particularly important event. Islam and Muslims were somehow directly or indirectly involved in it. And after 9/11, it seems the resurgence of religion is pretty much focused on Islam, which is not quite the case. Our focus here is not Islam, but at a global level. Our focus is very much Islam in Australia and Muslims in Australia. As I said early on, Islam, even in the Australian context, is not one thing. It is extremely complex. Different Muslim communities having very different ideas about what Islam means to them, different generations, different ethnic groups, linguistic groups, cultural groups, you name it. For those of you who don't know much about Islam and Muslims, well, Islam and Muslims had some connection to Australia from 17th, 18th century onwards. Right up to the middle of the 20th century, we had Muslims coming from a range of countries, but not in very large numbers. It was after the middle of the 20th century, in particular after the 1970s, the number of Muslims in Australia increased quite significantly. Today, when you look at the census figures, 2006 census figures, you will find that there are something like 400,000 Muslims in Australia. They come from roughly 120 different countries. Imagine the kind of diversity that would exist in the so-called Muslim community. For me, there is no Muslim community out there. There are Muslim communities. We are talking about roughly less than 2% of the Australian population here. 36% of Muslims in Australia are born here. So we are talking about second generation, third generation Muslims. We're also talking about future of Islam in this country. Well, it's very hard to predict what the future might look like, but these sessions are meant to explore some of the related issues. I'll mention a couple of things that seem to be important for me when I think about the future of Islam in this country. The first is the very important role the second and third generation Muslims actually make to a number of things in terms of what it means to be Muslim for them in an Australian context, the kinds of new ideas they bring into the discussion and debates, the interpretations they would actually bring into the debates as far as Islamic religious texts, etc., are concerned, and how they actually look at their relationship in terms of the life, whether it is political, social, economic, cultural life of Australia. It's an extremely important role that we are talking about. Fortunately, we have two Muslims who are from that generation, second-generation Muslims, who have very interesting ideas about these issues. For them, Islam is not a foreign religion here. Islam is very much an indigenous religion. Islam is right here. The context of Islam is Australia. Its social, political, cultural, intellectual, economic life. It is not something out there. It is something right here. And what it means to be Muslim in such a context may or may not be exactly similar to some other interpretations that may exist back somewhere else. The second thing I would actually mention, and I'll shut up, is basically when you look at Muslims, you can put them on a continuum as far as their interest in participation in Australian political, cultural, social and economic life is concerned. So we talk about participating in the life of this community and country as full citizens, not as paper citizens. I would put Muslims on a continuum. At the one end of the continuum, I would say the vast majority of Muslims fit into that category. They are arguing for or are active participants in the life of this country. At a pragmatic level, at an intellectual level, I would say that's the vast majority of Muslims. I would call them participants. At the other end of the continuum, there are what I might call isolationists, those for whom living in Australia as a Muslim is not necessarily in line with their understanding of what Islam is or what it means to be Muslim. I would say there are relatively few of them, but they do exist. In between, you could have a number of Muslims who I would call semi-participants. So basically, participating in the life of this country is not a particularly big problem for the vast majority of Muslims. That's the point I want to make. Now, coming to our speakers, we have here two wonderful speakers who represent the kind of future of Islam we want to see in this country, who are from second-generation Muslims, who have extremely high profile in the community. They write, they debate, they discuss, they put forward ideas, very interesting ideas, in fact. And both of them, as you can see, very young, and they are graduates of this university. Now let me introduce them one by one. Randa Abdul Fattah is a lawyer by training. She practices law, and she is also an award-winning author of young adult novels, and some of her work are on display on the first floor, on the ground floor. She's a regular contributor to a whole range of media, including The Age. She is one of the people, Muslims, you see in writers' festivals across Australia, and she received numerous recognitions and awards for her work. Walid Ali is our second speaker. Walid Ali is a lecturer in politics at Monash University, and like Randa, he's also an author, award-winning author, and regular contributor to a whole range of media, including ABC, The Age, The Guardian, and others. Like Randa, he also has received numerous awards for his work. So what we have here is a very interesting two speakers to present their views on a range of issues related to Islam. I'll leave that up to them, and I'm sure you will enjoy them. Please allow me in inviting Randa to speak first, followed by Walid, and Randa will speak for 20 minutes. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for having me. When I received an invitation to speak, the topic was the rise of Islam and the Australian experience. How does the Islamic community see itself as part of Australia, and how do Australians view the Islamic community? And this was also, these questions were posed on the website. Perhaps you've seen them, and if you're attending this session today to gain an answer to these questions, I'm very sorry to say that you're going to be disappointed. I don't have the answer, and I don't think you're ever going to get an intelligible answer because the questions are problematic. They're predicated on an assumption that there is one discrete, quantifiable Islamic community on the one hand, and that Australians all share the same views about Muslims, a self-evidently false proposition. Even the term, as Professor Abdullah Saeed spoke about, Islamic community is problematic. What makes a community Islamic? Is it the majority members' self-identification as Muslims? But what if that identification is based on cultural or familial affiliation? I'm Muslim because I was born Muslim, I'm Lebanese Muslim, I'm Bosnian Muslim, I'm Turkish Muslim. How do the topic questions address such complexities? And what of the influence of ethnic identification, which is often, unfortunately, how Muslims self-segregate, that is based on ethnic lines. So some mosques can cater to a predominantly Bosnian Muslim congregation or Turkish Muslim congregation and so on. And even in culturally and neutral mosques, ethnically neutral mosques or community organisations, when the tag Islamic is used, are we suggesting that the individuals, that their actions identify themselves as Muslim, in identifying themselves as Muslims, can properly be seen as a reflection of Islamic theology? That their motivations, actions and engagement with the wider community are somehow a mirror reflection of the Quran's teachings? To do that, and it's something that the media often does, is to deny the rich, diverse and complex nature of Islamic jurisprudence. It's to assume that Islamic teachings are uniform, when in fact they are multi-interpretive methods and various competing interpretations. It's much like the Jewish rabbinic tradition. So today I'm going to ignore the topic questions and address the issue of women in Islam, because quite frankly I'm not interested in pretending I represent the many, many Muslim communities in Australia, nor am I prepared to hazard a guess as to how a so-called monolithic Australian bloc views Muslims. So this is what I have to say today. First, because I'm a lawyer, I have to start with a disclaimer. I'm not an academic or an expert in Islamic law. I'm simply a lawyer and writer who is deeply interested in the classical Islamic legal tradition, particularly as it relates to gender equity. As somebody with a passionate conviction in Islam, I am immersing myself in the books of the past, and I'm overcome by the complexity of doctrines, diversity of opinions, and enormous amounts of disputations over a wide range of issues. It is not to Germaine Greer that I look for assertion of my rights as a woman. There is a clear precedent that a feminist struggle existed in Islamic classical discourse, and there's nothing seditious or divisive about saying this. The discourse on women's rights to equal participation in society is there in the classical texts. I could attribute my enlightenment to the first time I read the Moroccan sociologist Fatima Mernissi's book, The Veil and the Male Elite. In the preface to the English edition, she said, "We Muslim women can walk into the modern world with pride, knowing that the quest for dignity, democracy and human rights, for full participation in the political and social affairs of our country, stems from no imported Western values, but is a true part of the Muslim tradition. Ample historical evidence portrays women in the Prophet's Medina raising their heads from slavery and violence to claim their right to join as equal participants in the making of their Arab history. Women fled aristocratic tribal Mecca by the thousands to enter Medina, the Prophet's city in the 7th century, because Islam promised equality and dignity for all, for men and women. Every woman who came to Medina when the Prophet was the political leader of Muslims could gain access to full citizenship, the status of Sahabi, companion of the Prophet. Women enjoyed the right to enter into the councils of the Muslim community, to speak freely to its prophet leader, to dispute with the men, to fight for their happiness, and to be involved in the management of military and political affairs. The evidence is there in the works of religious history." Well, how to reconcile this evidence with what we are seeing in parts of the Muslim world in the contemporary age? I am no apologist who claims that there are no oppressed Muslim women. That there are Muslim women in the Muslim world who experience appalling oppression in the name of Islam is undeniable. On the one hand, Islam is clearly corrupted by tribalism and cultural traditions that contradict the ethical principles of justice, compassion, reasonableness and mercy at the heart of Islam's legal system. In those instances, a distinction must be made between culture and Islamic teachings. Female circumcision is a case in point. Even non-Muslims practice female circumcision in multi-faith but monocultural communities, but the practice is often represented in the Western media as Islamically sanctioned. But what we cannot also ignore is that in parts of the Muslim world today, the ethical principles of justice, reasonableness, compassion that underpin the Quran and Prophet's life are not displayed by some of those who hold themselves out as legitimately applying Islamic law. What we see is a tension between the moral and ethical objectives of the Quran on the one hand and legal rulings set in stone forever on the other. The irony, perhaps, is that our Stone Age is the contemporary age. Why this is so is not going to be fairly addressed in a 20-minute talk. It's the stuff of PhDs. I'm not interested in simplistically packaging a rich civilization into the trivial, into sound bites and PowerPoint slides. I hope I don't sound difficult, but I think it's an important point to make. We demand of Islam a debate on theological issues in the public space. I am not advocating that such discussions not occur, only that we appreciate the limitations of making sense of something when there is so much misunderstanding about the basics. I hope, as somebody who is constantly engaging with and trying to make sense of the sophisticated, robust, diverse debates that feature so prominently in the Islamic jurisprudential legacy, I feel an enormous pressure. It's a pressure that demands we have an esoteric conversation in the public domain. Because to fairly understand why the contemporary Muslim world is in crisis, particularly when it comes to the status of women, you must have more than an elementary understanding of Islam. And this applies to non-Muslims and Muslims, perhaps more importantly to Muslims. What are the legitimate sources of Islam, we may ask? What is Sharia law? Who can claim authority to represent or interpret the divine will? Is there a crisis in religious authority? Why? What was the impact of colonialism on the juristic classes? What is it that we want to understand about the Muslim communities in Australia? The motivation really guides the focus of the discussion. If there are some people who fear Muslims because of September 11 and the Bali bombings and so on, do we want to unpackage Islam's position on terrorism, on jihad? Okay, well, we first must understand how are legal rulings determined? Who determines them? Is there plurality? What are the sources upon which the legal rulings are based? These are the issues Muslim communities are grappling with now and in the past. Let me give you a very simple example. I've given many talks, and one common tendency is to judge Islam through Christian lens and paradigms, so that Islam's institutional structure is assumed to have a papacy or some similar hierarchical organisation. There is a fundamental difference. There is no church in Islam, and no person embodies God's divine authority. Unlike the Catholic Church, for example, Islam has no priesthood or institutional church as a repository of divine authority. Islam is represented not by an individual or body of individuals, but by texts which must be interpreted. There is no authoritative centre other than God and the Prophet, and both God and the Prophet are represented by texts. You have the Quran on the one hand and the Sunnah Hadith, the traditions and sayings, documented sayings of the Prophet. Muslims may strive to discover the divine will, but no one has the authority to lay exclusive claim to it. While Muslims all accept that the Quran is the literal word of God, there is debate over which sayings of the Prophet are authentic, unreliable, or just plain fabricated. And there is a sophisticated methodology in Islamic jurisprudence for assessing the authenticity of these sayings. And I want to give you an example so that you can put this in context. The recent laws in Afghanistan, which effectively stipulated that women cannot refuse to have sexual intercourse with their husbands and can only seek work, education, or visit the doctor with their husband's permission. That was effectively the basis of the law. It was seemingly justified on the basis that it was a legitimate reflection of Islamic teachings. And so we have here a contest, not between culture and religion, but between competing claims as to what reflects the divine will. In this particular instance, certain sayings attributed to the Prophet Muhammad are deemed as authentic and are being relied upon to justify such laws. That there is debate as to whether the Prophet made such statements, in other words, serious challenges have been made as to the statement's authenticity, is ignored. A simplistic or dismissive way of dealing with this is to say, this is simply another example of Islam oppressing women, which is to immediately accept the Afghani law as an authentic expression of the predominant values of the Islamic tradition. It is to ignore the fact that there is a science and methodology employed to assess whether a statement attributed to the Prophet was in fact uttered by him, and that historically these statements, which are demeaning to women, and most of these statements are used in establishing laws that are demeaning to women in Saudi Arabia, for example, but they have been the subject of rigorous debate and investigation. It's very hard to reconcile the contemporary scene with the historical. One of the most important and influential Islamic thinkers and scholars, Khalid Abu al-Fadl, who is a professor at UCLA in the School of Law, wrote an article in recognition of women, and if you'll indulge me, I just want to read this to you. The fact is that Islam neither limits women to the private sphere, nor does it give men supremacy over the public and private life. One notices that the Greek and Roman cultures which preceded Islamic civilization did not produce a single eminent woman philosopher or jurist. Likewise, until the 1700s, Europe failed to produce female social, political or legal jurists. Islam did exactly the opposite in every respect, so much so that Omar ibn al-Khattab, who was one of the prominent leaders, used to entrust Shafa bint Abdullah as an inspector over the market in Medina. She was a woman, obviously. Moreover, Islamic history is replete with examples of female professors who tutored famous male jurists. Yet the sad legacy of our time is that we have taken women back to the pre-Islamic era by excluding them from public exposure or involvement. A modern scholar, Muhammad al-Ghazali, once described this phenomenon as the ascendancy of Bedouin jurisprudence. What he meant by this term is that in much of contemporary culture, the world revolves around men and everything is channeled to their service. The traditions of the Prophet reveal that he used to assist his wives in household duties, but most modern scholars have not had the probity to suggest that the practice of men helping a lending hand in the home is to be recommended or even required in certain circumstances, except in my house, because I always use that as an example. Most men are content to ignore this and selectively emphasise whatever in the Sunnah, the Prophet's traditions, serves their interests. It is well known that women like Aisha, Salama, and he lists several others, were trusted with preserving and teaching 1/4 of our religion. I have heard many times that the doctrines of Islam are essentially uniform and cohesive, and it's something I certainly heard growing up. This may be the case when it comes to Muslims' core beliefs, such as the belief in one God, Judgment Day, the prophets of God, including Adam, Noah, Moses, Jesus, Muhammad. But the more debatable issues about women's dress or inheritance laws or polygamy as examples are popularly represented as fixed and settled, flying in the face of the rich and nuanced debates that characterise the Islamic intellectual heritage. There is lengthy evidence of classical jurists grappling with the issue of the Quran and Sunnah being texts to be interpreted by human agents. The debate over women's rights and status in the Islamic legal tradition is not a simple one, and deserves more respectful treatment and scholarship than the media allows. We still do not appreciate that Islam cannot be reduced to some kind of vending machine culture where you put in a coin for a certain answer and it is simply and instantly delivered. That is something Muslim communities in Australia are working on from within. That is, trying to build their base of qualified Australian Muslim experts in Islamic law. The difficulty, I think, is that our internal struggle is in the public eye. And we all know that the public eye does not tolerate that which cannot be trivialised, simplified and easily processed. When I say the public eye, I mean the media. According to Muslim scholars, a conservative count reveals at least 2,500 extraordinary women jurists, narrators of hadith and poets throughout history. When I contemplate the future of Islam in Australia, I find myself reflecting more and more on our past, on our legacy, not as some glorified, romanticised golden age, which remains unattainable, but as a precedent for the way forward, as a precedent to confront those who demean women in the name of Islam. My engagement with the texts that provide a glimpse into the Prophet's life, as well as the principles articulated in the Quran, provide me with an educated and intuitive sense that the repression of women is an ugly travesty and seems incompatible with the mercy, beauty, fairness and justice of Islam. Thank you.